morning, folks. My name is Vikrant Karbir. I'm a repeat entrepreneur. Today, we have veteran CISOs. We have Ganesh Krishnan, who's been CISO at multiple tech companies, and he is the founder entrepreneur of a tech startup. And then we have Mahesh Ayyala, who's a veteran CISO. He's been at multiple places, brings a lot of experience to the table. And what we are going to do is, today we're going to talk about the broader topic of user risk, insider risk within enterprises, right? How are CISOs looking at this issue? How are they solving some of the issues, and what type of solutions they are seeing across the board? And we're going to talk about other issues tied to this. So Mahesh, it is best if we start with you, if you can introduce yourself to the audience, and then Ganesh, if you can do the same, and then we'll get into the question and answer session.
Okay, sounds good. Hi folks, Mahesh Ayyala, CISO, the fintech startup. Been here for 2.5 years. Before that, I was at another fintech, and before that, 10 plus years at the bank in the technology space for 25 years. Looking forward to the conversation with Ganesh and Vikrant.
Ganesh.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Vikrant. Thank you, Mahesh, both of you, for the opportunity to have this discussion. My name is Ganesh Krishnan. I've been a security practitioner for over 2 decades, CISO at companies like Yahoo, LinkedIn, and Atlassian. Currently, I run a cybersecurity startup.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. So let's get started with the dialogue. And I'll use the external code to get the dialogue started, right? So let's start with Verizon 2024 data breach report, right? One of the interesting stats in that report is that 68% of the breaches involved a non-malicious, and that's interesting, a non-malicious human element, like a person falling victim to a social engineering attack or making an error, right? This has been around, there's nothing new about it, but the number, the number seems to be going up, which is what percentage of the breaches are caused by the human element. As veteran operational CISOs, how do you react to that, right? What's your reaction to that, statistics? What's your reaction to that statement? And maybe, Mahesh, we can get started with you, and then Ganesh, you can.
Yeah, and again, right, I think what that validates is what is happening in a corporate environment, right? So even the email and other forms have been there for a long period of time. What I've seen in my own career is, the threat vector of email continues to be one of the biggest areas where social engineering is being deployed. And what has evolved is now the employees of a company are much more targeted. There are LinkedIn scrapings, others happening where they know who has started at a company, and using that as a new hires to target it. But I think as the company has built out and expanded, what we notice is we're building a lot of assets in an organization, and it can be financial assets, it can be data assets, and IP patents and other things that are a target, and a lot of organizations, APTs out there are targeting these employees, and so that's one area of social engineering aspect that's coming along. Now there is a second aspect. There are employees sometimes inadvertently is leaking the information. The controls that were working before, the EDRs, XDRs, and other firewall controls, are no longer sufficient in the age of ChatGPT, and so information and everything else is leaking. So I think there are many aspects to the insider threat. I think that's probably a misnomer in sense. Sometimes it's malicious, but a lot of times it's inadvertently the avenues of all of these data leaks, and so validates what Verizon is saying, but it also kind of brings up the extended threat vectors and the nature we are dealing with in this age. So I'm sure Ganesh has a lot to add here too.
Yeah, Ganesh, you want to step in? And
yes, thank you, Mahesh. So, when I heard this stat some time back, and Verizon has been publishing this for some time, I almost fell off my chair because, as a practitioner in my past life, a lot of our focus was to protect from the outside in, as like Mahesh was alluding to. And the threat vectors have been constantly changing. and people have become sort of the biggest attack points, especially for external attackers, because as the front doors close, basically they can get a much stronger foothold into a corporate environment, into a company, by just going after their employees, because they tend to have a lot more access, and then they can escalate privileges from there. So I think the threat is valid. I think that the what I see in the industry and what I did in my past life was the actual focus and investment from a cybersecurity perspective is much lower compared to the external threats in most enterprise environments. A lot of times, the most common thing that gets done with employees is cyber awareness training, which is just a starting point. And there is a need, I believe, to systematically solve this problem
Yeah.
for companies.
Go ahead, Mahesh. Yeah.
You're teasing what Ganesh said further, right? So, in the age of pandemic and everything else, the people not going to office, the typical traditional network boundaries have changed, and so it kind of migrated to human identity focused, right? So where people are working remotely, and that kind of puts us in a situation of bullseye on the individual's employees, and the controls that used to work well, are no longer effective because everybody's working remotely, right? So teasing that further, now understanding your own networks and the fact that the email is still a primary mechanism, all of that lends into the situation of exfiltration of information easily, or through a social engineering aspect around it. But and I think that also, for the further introduction of ChatGPT and others, made it easier, where the co-pilots and everything else also are bringing the information that can be leaked easily. And so again, the aspect is there is non-malicious aspect around all of these folks interacting with these various tools, and but from an organization perspective, the threat of loss of information has tremendously increased, because there are not enough controls that are integrated with all of these solutions. So
Got it. Makes sense. So if I understood it, and let me see if I can play a little bit of devil's advocate out here. So, conceptually, what I heard right now is like, look, when we talk about insider risk, historically, it's essentially been the purview of, for lack of a better term, malicious activity, number one. And then the non-malicious, essentially, or accidental errors that were essentially caused. And typically the attack vector has been through phishing and email, right? That's been the dominant attack vector. And then with the advent of collaborative applications, right? Rampant data sharing, accidental or malicious, also has been, some of the areas that the operational teams have to look into, right? Now, as we are going to the new environment, right? So let me throw some variables and exactly to the point you guys said, right? Malicious is a small piece, as we all know. Accidental, negligent is a larger piece. Then, as Mahesh, you rightly pointed out, you have a whole bunch of applications, right? There are a whole bunch of applications people have on their endpoints devices. And then, there are a whole bunch of social engineering attacks that are also actually happening from different vectors over there, right? And then, historically, user risk has been considered the area of training, right? Okay, you got phishing, you got some, solutions over there. And then let's do basically, one-time training. If you take a step back, right, broadly speaking, right, how would you look upon user risk? What are the type of user risk? How would you guys look upon that? Number one. And number two is, can you frame for the audience, what are the new attack vectors that are emerging from a CISO standpoint? If that makes sense.
Yeah, so the user experience, right? So typically involve the networks and technology that would that includes going to the various web pieces, to email, to the Slack messaging, to other and ChatGPTs of the world.
Yeah.
All of these are all various avenues a user would typically be interacting, and hence can be socially engineered, LinkedIn to others too. So all of these where they're interacting with it. So the challenge of a CISO and a data organization is, how do you monitor, at the same time enable, right, all of these users to do their job, at the same time protect the organization. So that's where the challenge of dropping the various technologies. We at my other places have adopted a lot of zero trust framework and technologies that definitely helps with the authentication, the authorization, and to some aspect monitoring of all the activities of the user. But that does not substitute the training, because you cannot decipher the intent of the user, right? So it kind of leads into that space of, how do you understand what is a normal user behavior versus abnormal, and how do you monitor if somebody is intending to really exfiltrate the data, right? So kind of goes back into the data classification of the world. Can we do it in a way, and can we tie all of this together to say, yes, Mahesh is copy and pasting it. It has sensitive data that needs to be blocked. So then kind of brings in, again, do we need extensions to the browsers? The browser has become the portal to all of these accesses versus agents and everything else. So it's a combination of all of these things that are happening.
Yeah.
And what I am finding out is there's no one answer, but it is a series of things you would stitch together to address it. Ganesh, from the other end, how are you seeing it, and what do you think?
Yeah, Ganesh, if I may, right? So just to frame what you said, which is an excellent point, is the first thing is to understand or have visibility into all the user activities without acting like a big brother or a big sister out there, right? To understand what are the activities that your collaborative users are doing across, or what type of collaborations happening. That's the first part. Ganesh, if you can build up on that, that'll be great.
Yeah. I mean, I think if we look at all the different activities that users or employees do, right, like all the way from identity, SaaS, data exfiltration that Mahesh was alluding to, IP exfiltration, device posture, right? What attackers have started doing is, as organizations are moving to stronger forms of MFA or passkeys, attackers are trying to infect machines and then get users to install rogue browser extensions so that then they can have a much stronger foothold and hijack the session instead of hijacking the identity. And then obviously, Mahesh, at the start mentioned email and phishing continue to be huge risk vectors as a way to get the initial infection or initial foothold in place. And all that starts by targeting users' reconnaissance through platforms like LinkedIn, where, if I'm targeting certain personas in a company based on access, then that's where I would start as an attacker. So it's a spectrum of things that then needs to be stitched together by the attacker and also by the defender as a result.
So conceptually, we're talking about obviously we know this, we have been in this business, right? As the threat actors or the adversaries are looking into the organization, figuring out where do they start, like do they go after the sysadmin population, or do they go after the the executives, and then what attack vector depending on the size, the structure, and what the business of the organizations. Quick question, right? So there are various forms, right? Obviously we don't have time to go into all the nitty-gritties out here, but conceptually, so you have essentially you got to have, as Mahesh you rightly said, you got to have some instrumentation to understand what's going on in your organization with your employees. Number two is, then once you get that visibility, right, as to, here are the user risk areas, there's a phishing, here's basically, rogue application, certain admins are prime targets, certain employees or execs, what have you, right? How do you, that's a challenge, right? How do you have that conversation with your business users? Like, because what you're asking is, first of all, on the business side, you don't want, your security to come like, hey, we did this, this, blah, blah. How do you guys do that? What best practices, tools have you guys used in the past?
So the insider risk is an area that it covers many functions within an organization, right? So it is a combination with HR, legal, it might be IT security, and there might be other groups involved, right? So what the best practice of some of these things are, it needs to be a small group and of these set of folks that review a given activity and develop procedures and processes that would support how to investigate, right? So security is always in the leading edge, where you get to see an activity, but they don't get to decide something is good or bad, right? So they understand probably from an instrumentation perspective, you have reached out to this website, you have uploaded this document, and it might be classified in certain way, and all of that information typically can be should be shared with this group of people to understand in the larger context, what is this person trying to do? Is it accidental? Is it malicious? Is there a pattern to this behavior? And all of that, and all of that can then lead into the next level of conversations, which usually involves HR and legal. And so from a best practices perspective, what we have done is created policies, create procedures, provide training, and then having clear rules around what are the protected data and where they need to reside, and then having technology tools for both for encrypting and monitoring and etc. And then have a business process around when you have activities that needs to be discussed at a larger level. There are committees and other set of activity groups that can be passed along to, so that they can take it to the next level. At least that's what I've seen. And I think some of these also comes from my interaction with the Carnegie Mellon. They have developed a lot of frameworks around it and some of the industry best practices. So that's what I've seen. I'm sure, Ganesh, you have other ideas there.
Yeah, I mean, I think to add on to what Mahesh has been saying, right? One of the things I've gotten bit a lot in the past life as a practitioner is having proper business justification, especially because, when you talk about people and people security, almost in most cases, what we are trying to do is to introduce controls which gets perceived as hurdles that prevent people from doing their job. And so, the first place I would say, that if I had to go back and fix some of the things that I try to do, where I would start is actually having enough data about how, from a people perspective, having enough data about what are the activities that we see that could pose a threat to the company and why, and then be able to use that data to actually figure out what controls make sense in the context of the business that we are in, right? So for instance, a lot of security practitioners I know and I talk to want to do application whitelisting, right? And that's a valid thing, right? Because users install a lot of applications at any given day, and they can end up shooting themselves in the foot, including myself, and because we all make mistakes, right? But if I take that to the business and say, hey, this is a great security controls to have, and will prevent breaches, that may not be sufficient, because people will say, hey, you're going to kill my productivity because I want my designers to use whatever they want, I want my developers to use whatever they want. But if I had the data that said, hey, here is my employee population that I see is at risk because of this particular installation pattern, or here are some apps that people are installing that are sensitive in a specific case, then I could take that data and say, look, now our chance of getting infected in this particular area, where these particular people have access to our crown jewels, which may be data, IP, whatever, has changed, then that case becomes a lot stronger. And I could do that on a group by group basis instead of actually affecting the entire company by, blanketly installing application. So I think having, if I were to do this from scratch, I would have a lot of data and visibility into insider activity, so that I can then use that to basically figure out what controls make sense from a cybersecurity perspective.
So in a nutshell, essentially, in addition to visibility, you got to have auditable data that you can actually share with the business users, right? And talk about which controls are working, not working, and all that. So Ganesh, if I may, right, put you on the spot, right? So in that construct, right? So you do that, and Mahesh, you also said, as practitioners, you have to do that. Your teams have to do it. What happens next, though, right, in terms of remediation? Because, it could be, the volume could be a lot out here, as an example, number one. Number two, there is a broader question of okay, how much of it can you actually prevent? How much of it can you prevent? You don't want the damage to be done, right? What actions can you proactively take? What actions do you, for lack of a better term, reactive after the fact take? How do you balance that? And Mahesh, if you can jump also on that, but we'll start with Ganesh, and if you can give your perspective on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think from my perspective, security is always a combination of understanding risk, having good amount of guardrails, which means preventive controls, and then having enough detection, because you can't have guardrail everything, right? Because people have to do their jobs. So now that's where I start. The other spectrum of cybersecurity teams that I've seen, myself and as I talk to different practitioners, is that there is like a lot of tools and a lot of things that cybersecurity teams have to protect, right? I mean, you talk about like protecting the entire business, which includes the IT systems, the product, whatever you're trying to business you're in. That's a wide scope. And usually the resourcing and the teams, that the cybersecurity teams are usually understaffed and are usually just like dealing with the daily firefights in a lot of cases. So doing proactive work itself is a challenge, right? So in that mentality, you have to have some automation built in based on your risk assessments and your guardrails and your detections, so that you can basically more efficiently fix things and do your job more effectively, versus having to do everything manually. Like, if you have to go say, oh, these 5 people are doing installing certain apps, and I just going back to one example to just put it in context. If I have to go and a security person has to flag each of them and say, are you okay, what is going on here, versus, hey, once we understand the pattern, let's actually go auto remediate it, right? And that may become a lot more efficient for security teams to operate that way, right? So that's my perspective on it. Over to you, Mahesh.
If you can weigh in on this.
Yeah, and again, right, I think what Ganesh said, right? So it kind of goes back to is your cyber risk assessments as you do it. I identify your crown jewels from an assets and process and systems, and build everything around them, right? Because at the end of the day, you want to secure things that you care are important to the organizations, and then you kind of grade your security accordingly, right? So confidential to internal to whatever data classifications and things, right? So it's important that you do your work up front and identify your crown jewels from a data and system and processes, and then develop your controls that commensurate that, right? So for example, if you identify you are a software company and then you have a lot of IPs around certain software code, having controls for your GitHub to, your ability when somebody downloads your repository, getting alerts around it, monitoring what can be uploaded, and removing your personal access tokens, right? Things that you can do, and then scanning for secrets and everything else. So again, the idea is, you identify your important assets, then you put your controls around it, and then you train your users around it, and then at the end of it, we can always limit things. There are always preventive controls, there are always detective controls. But humans are humans. We all have our motivation. Not every control can be 100% working effectively. So if you have a series of controls that are working around with each other, that should prevent most of the data breaches, right? So it's that aspect that we need to focus on. Is we start with all of the things that Ganesh has talked about, and then your layers of technical controls and process controls, and be proactive around it, right? I think that should get us into place. We also do introduce like canaries and other things. So now you want to be a little bit offensive, you can drop in all those other things to see is things leaking, and maybe that's another way of looking into things. So some other things we would think.
Got it. So totally makes sense, right? So, and just building on this conversation, right? As you basically become more selective about which controls to essentially affect and which controls you don't affect, right? Depending on basically the crown jewels business construct scenario. Can you guys talk about the topic of discussion? This is like agent versus non-agent, right? Agents clearly, preventive blocking advantages over there, resiliency, manageability of agents, especially some of the, events happened in the past. But then the trade-off, right? Can you prevent truly with a non-agent based architecture? Maybe Mahesh, if you can start and then we can comment.
Sure. And that kind of goes back to partly there's a religious and philosophical aspect around some of these things, right? Yeah. And partly is like how you're architected and also the industry you live in, right? I think That's the honest truth of a lot of these things. So if you are in an industry, you're much more regulated and you need to be monitored and you need to understand at a depth, right? So recent example, CrowdStrike, right? So if you have an agent and it is integrated on an OS level, now you get to see more things that are happening.
Mm-hmm.
Now that obviously has a price in sense of performance and, activities and other things that, so it will be much more invasive in nature. So I think it goes back to is what is the earlier conversation. What are you trying to protect? What are you worried about?
Mm-hmm.
And what level of information you need to understand for a user behavior to see whether something malicious, non-malicious, loss of data is happening, right?
Yep.
And that should answer the question of the agent extension and API, right? Because for most of the work, probably API can do the job, right? Because in today's world where browser is your key client that kind of takes you to the external world, and that traffic can be intercepted and then monitored through APIs to wrestle things, that might suffice it. Now, there might be need for other capabilities or understanding of what else is happening, right? Where somebody downloaded something onto their laptop and trying to do it, and so an API might die if it doesn't make a call. Then it does not know what's happening, right? So there is that need of it. So it is finding that balance of based on what are you trying to protect, and the concerns of the organization would lead you to where probably you'll end up with a combination. Right?
Yep.
So some you need a much more detailed, in-depth, and for some, you don't need it. So I think it's that finding the right balance. And I think there are all the vendors. It's easy to say I am API. It's easy to say I'm agent-driven. I think it's helping that, giving that flexibility. Maybe for certain populations, we will have to deploy the agents because they are high-risk users by the nature of the job. For some others, maybe they are salespeople. They just only use solutions for them, right? So it's Ganesh, I'm sure you have more to add there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Completely agree with what you said. I mean, I think it depends on the situation. It depends on the business, what's important to the business, and how mission critical certain things are, right? So recent things like Mahesh, which you've alluded to with the CrowdStrike incident that have come to light, is this whole notion of cyber resiliency, and that is even have been there with the malware infections where your business stops running. And for businesses that are really concerned about it, that's actually now related to cybersecurity. It's become also a cybersecurity problem. So you look at it on what you're trying to protect, and then combine that with what is your business, and then what is the level of resiliency you need and operability, and then basically come up with the right solution. And that will involve trade-offs. So in some cases, if there are mission critical applications running in a production environment where you may say, hey, I'm like uncomfortable deploying an agent that has kernel level access. In that case, you may say, okay, you know what, like I'll maybe have an agentless solution to do X, and I'm okay with the 80%, and here is the trade-off. And as long as you're willing to accept that as a business, you're transparent, that's the best way to go.
I think excellent points, right? So essentially what it's pointing out to is the need for the security team, the need for CISOs and their teams to be very closely aligned with their business, because the business nuances, the service nuances of the business basically will dictate what the trade-off and which solutions might be appropriate to protect the crown jewels, to protect the resiliency of critical systems, right? This has been an excellent dialogue. Thank you so much for making time, Mahesh. Both of you. Any parting thoughts before we conclude the podcast? Mahesh, maybe we start with you.
So I think we summarized all of the discussions. We started with the Verizon data loss, and then closing with the conversation around insider threat and the how best to protect it. And I think the summary is data loss will continue to happen as long as you have something to protect, right? So I think the CISOs and operational strategic is continuously assess and understand what is valuable for the company, where do they live, and what kind of controls and who's accessing it. So having that understanding, access kind of reviews to controls to providing just in time and having a layered approach to those controls, and then monitoring it at every step of it should help alleviate most of the scenarios where the loss is there. And then having an incident response if a loss, but can you respond in a fashion that would mitigate the loss to the organization? So having all of that, I suspect would take us a long way. It might not eliminate all the breaches, but it does take us to a place where it will be limited and losses are truly due to nature that we may not be able to manage or control.
Thank you. Thank you. Ganesh, very well said. Ganesh, any parting thoughts from
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Mahesh. That's great thoughts there. From my standpoint, right? So in my past life, looking back, I probably ended up taking a more technology-centric view to cybersecurity in terms of, hey, start with the basic technical controls, the checklist, the best practices. If I were to do it all over again, I would combine that with a business and a people-centric view to cybersecurity, because the reason we are here is 2/3 of security breaches are due to people. So anytime you assess a risk, I would recommend take that business and people-centric view, like we have been discussing throughout this podcast, not just only a technology-centric view. Awesome. So that would be one of my suggestions.
Awesome. Very nice. Thank you, Jen. Thank you both of you for your time. And then with this, we'll wrap up the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.